Last year when Trae Young missed the All-Star game, I didn't think much of it. It's a competitive league and snubs happen every year. But this year when he missed it for the second year in a row, it's when I started to get a little suspicious. Full disclosure, I've always been a bit of a Trae Young hater. I thought he was a little overhyped, and he was. People forget the kind of hype this guy had the first few years of his career, especially after he took the Hawks to the ECF in 2021. Like, if you go back and look at all the NBA ranked lists that publications were putting out at the time, he was consistently ranked above guys like Devin Booker or Donovan Mitchell, which... no. So yeah, at the time, I was a bit of a Trae Young denier, because when I looked at him, I did see someone who was immensely talented, but I also saw someone who was a complete pylon on defense and was really inefficient, and I was stuck wondering when the rest of the world was going to wake up to this reality. And then the rest of the world woke up, and they have not slept a second since. Over the last few years, the narrative has completely shifted on Trae Young from one end to the other end, going from way overrated to now way underrated. People saying he's not top 25, he's not a star, he's trash. I mean, you have lists coming out that put Trae Young below guys like Jaylen Brown, LaMelo Ball, or Jamal Murray. All great players in their own right, but come on, they're not better than Trae Young, let's be real. And that's when I had to kind of take my Trae Young hater cap off and kind of look around and be like, okay, it's just starting to get a little out of hand. Listen, we all know Trae Young is an inefficient player, but I think it's a little overstated just how inefficient he is. Trae's true shooting percentage this year is 58.3%, which, while not very good, is only 0.8% lower than All-Star Anthony Edwards. It's only 1.1% worse than All-Star starter Damian Lillard. It's only 1.9% worse than All-Star Donovan Mitchell. And only 2.2% worse than well-agreed-upon top 10 player Jason Tatum, and the list goes on, you get the point. So is Trae probably the least efficient superstar in the game? Yeah, absolutely, but it's not by a country mile like some people would like you to believe. It's also important to take into account the full context of his inefficiency. For conversation's sake, let's compare him to the four other players we just mentioned. While Trae is shooting the lowest percentage out of these players, you have to look at his playmaking when determining the kind of impact he has on the offensive side of the floor. He's second in the league in assists at an astounding 10.9 per game. No other player on that list I just gave you is even close. With Dame at 6.7 per game, Donovan Mitchell with 6.3 per game, Ant with 5.3 per game, and Tatum with 4.8 per game. So when you take into account the full picture, strictly offensively speaking, I'd say Trae Young is the most impactful player on this list. And I make the point of saying strictly offensively speaking because obviously the other glaring hole in Trae's game is his defense. Listen, is Trae Young a great defender? No. Is Trae Young a good defender? Also no. Is Trae Young a decent defender? Not really, but hear me out. Can you blame him? Seriously, how much do you really expect him to do on the defensive end of the floor? Forget the fact that he's literally carrying a team's offense on his back, putting all of his energy into that. He's also 6'1" with a 6'1" wingspan. Name me an elite 6'1" defender who is also carrying the team's load on his back on the offensive end. You cannot find a player like that. In previous years, I would have criticized Trae and I would have said, you know what, yes, he doesn't have the tools to be an elite defender, but he can at least try, because it was clear up until this year that he wasn't trying. But this year, he's actually putting in effort, and it shows. Defense is the kind of thing that you more so need the eye test to really verify, but there are a few stats that help back this up. His steals have jumped from 1.1 last season to 1.4 this season, which is a career high for Trae. His steal percentage has jumped from the 28th percentile to the 58th percentile in the league, and his foul percentage fell from the 100th percentile down to the 82nd percentile, which to me indicates that he's sitting in the chair more, he's defending more, and due to that, he's picking up a few more fouls. Ultimately, I think the biggest flaws in Trae's game, being his defense and his inefficiency, while certainly present, are becoming a bit exaggerated when it comes to basketball discussion focused around his value as a player. Let's hone in now on Trae's All-Star snub this year. When you talk about All-Stars, it seems like there's basically two criteria that determine whether or not someone is worthy to be an All-Star. Number one is the individual stats that they're putting up, and number two is team success. I found Trae's snub to be a little confounding this year, considering that he's 11th in the league in points per game and 2nd in the league in assists per game. 26.7 points per game and 10.9 assists per game are pretty clearly all-star numbers. Compare that to another player who was voted all-star this year in Anthony Edwards, who's averaging 26.2 points, 5.2 rebounds, and 5.2 assists. Okay, but Trae is hyper inefficient, so maybe that's it. Maybe Ant is just way more efficient, but no, as we mentioned before, his true shooting percentage is only 0.8% higher than Trae's. Okay, but the Wolves were the 1 seed the day that all-star voting closed on January 20th. Of course, Ant had to be an all-star. And absolutely, putting up those numbers on the number 1 seed every single time is going to get you an all-star. That level of team success is definitely able to carry more weight to a performance, even though the stat line is not as impressive as Trae's. So it just comes down to team success then, right? Because as of that same date, the Hawks were 10th out east. So maybe it's fair. Trae is having a great season, but his team is just not successful enough to warrant him being an all-star. Makes sense to me. But wait a second. The Lakers, on that same date, were the 10 seed out west. Yet they had not just 1, but 2 all-stars. Now, obviously, LeBron James is LeBron James. He's going to get voted in by the fans. He's a starter. I'm not even saying anything about that. But Anthony Davis was voted in by the coaches and by the players to be on the bench, despite the team's lack of success. And then people will say, oh, okay, but AD's having an amazing season, man. He's balling out. He's putting up crazy numbers. And you're right. He's having a fantastic season. 25 points a game, 12 boards a game, 2.5 blocks. He's doing it all. But wait a minute. Trae is putting up 26.3 points a game and 10.9 assists a game. To me, equally or at least very close to the same level of impressiveness as what AD is doing. And they're both doing it on bad teams. So why does the lack of team success not affect AD's campaign, but it affects Trae? Especially when you take into account that AD is the team's second all-star, but Trae would have been the Hawks' only all-star. Overall, honestly, I could make a whole video on why all-star voting is just super messed up and inconsistent, because then you've got players like Domantas Sabonis. He checks the hell out of both of those criteria. On the 20th, the Kings were the 7 seed out west, which doesn't sound amazing, but it is a very tight race out west, and they were 5 games above 500, so they were having a successful season playing winning basketball. And Sabonis is averaging an insane 20 points, 13 boards, and 8.3 assists a game. But he's not an all-star, and neither is De'Aaron Fox. That team gets 0 all-stars? Make that make sense. It seems to me that the rules get bent around any player that isn't Trae Young, and I just can't seem to figure out why. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about Trae Young's 2023-24 season versus some other historical seasons. This year, Trae Young put up 26.7 points a game, 10.9 assists per game, 42.7% field goal percentage, 37.1 three-point percentage, and is on a 10 seed. 2017-18 John Wall averaged 9.4 points a game, 9.6 assists per game, 42% field goal percentage, and 37.1 three-point percentage, and he was on an 8 seed, and he was voted an all-star. Every single statistical category I just named, he was down below Trae, other than three-point percentage, which they were the exact same, and he was only 1 seed higher on his team, yet he was voted an all-star. Let's go even further back to 2005-2006 Tracy McGrady, who averaged 24.4 points a game, 6.5 rebounds per game, 40% field goal percentage, 31.2 three-point percentage, on a 12 seed. As far as I can tell, this is the least efficient player to ever make an all-star without being on a successful team. Like a 12 seed, shooting 41 and 31, and that's an all-star? But you're using Trae Young's 10 seed and 43 and 37 to say that he can't be an all-star? I just don't understand. Let's look at one more. 15-16 Paul George. He averaged 23 points a game, 7 boards a game, 42 field goal percentage, 36 three-point percentage, 8 seed, all-star, not Trae. Numbers significantly less impressive than Trae's. All-star. Why? So you look at this season and you see players having worse seasons than Trae Young getting all-stars over him. You look at history and you see players who had worse seasons than Trae Young getting all-stars over him. If you're Trae Young, you look around and you're asking, why they say fuck me for? It would be irresponsible for me to speculate why, but honestly, I kind of think Trae Young just might not be all that well liked around the league. There's things to back this up too. For example, Trae's disagreements and arguments with the Hawks' last head coach Nate McMillan that ultimately led to his firing. Of course, what also led to his firing was him being a bad coach, but let's not act like Trae's disagreements with him didn't heavily factor into that decision. You can also look at the Athletics player poll from this past year as more proof of this. When asked who is the most overrated player in the NBA, Trae Young was overwhelmingly the most voted player with 14.8% of the votes, miles ahead of number 2 who received just 7.4%. And of course we all saw that clip of Steph Curry talking to Trae about his snub, saying it's just politics. Again, while I can't say exactly what it is or why it is that players and coaches around the league seem to not like Trae Young, it seems pretty clear that it played some sort of part into him not being selected, because when you look at some of the players around the league that were selected over him, his season was undeniably better. So is Trae Young a perfect player? No. but does any such player exist? I really do believe that his deficiencies are vastly overemphasized and they're highlighted way more than any other player in the league for some reason. The public perception of him has swung way too negative over the past few years to the point where he switched from being overrated to being wildly underrated, and I think it's time he gets the respect that he deserves.